ọwọ́ rẹ̀ wò ènìyàn ọmọ ènìyàn ẹ ò ráyé lóde náà. ènìyàn yẹsẹ̀ ọwọ́ rẹ̀ wò ènìyàn ọmọ ènìyàn ẹ ò ráyé lóde náà. ló ṣe fún ọ tó lè fọwọ́ lẹ́rán. kí ló ṣe fún ọ tó lè fọwọ́ lẹ́rán kó máa wòye wọn. tómi lọ ṣàkàn sí tómi lọ ṣàgbélò sí tómi pé lápèpá. Marcus ló fún mi ní gift lórí TikTok yìí ó ṣèṣe Marcus tá à ń sọ̀rọ̀ rẹ̀. Marcus tọ̀dọ̀ yín ò lè jẹ́ ọ̀daràn. Marcus ọ̀jọ̀gbọ́n tọ̀dọ̀ yín kò lè jẹ́ ti òpònú. Thank you Mr. Marcus, God bless you. ènìyàn yẹsẹ̀ ọwọ́ rẹ̀ wò ènìyàn ọmọ ènìyàn ẹ ò ráyé lóde náà. ẹ̀yin èèyàn ẹ fún mi gift lórí TikTok náà o ẹ fún mi gift o kí ló dé. wẹ́ẹ̀ làkàndá time ti lọ lórílẹ̀‐èdè Nàìjíríà ẹ má jẹ́ kí n gbà àkókò yín ó lágbára o ọmọ arúgbó irun òfò ti wà níbi dírẹ́ẹ̀dì mi o bóyá o ní ọ́fọ́ọ̀sì mi ti ń fi gé o wow. irun funfun ti wà ní dírẹ́ẹ̀dì o. ṣé mo dàgbà lọ́jọ́ kí n nírun funfun? báà mi ló bí mi lásìkò tó ti darúgbó. àrògbọ́n dá sí well ẹ má jẹ́ kí n gbà kókó yín time ti lọ gan. strictly business and strictly on United Nations Declaration on the right of indigenous people. Ntí àwọn Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí Marcus Ìjìnlẹ̀ àti Sọ́ngbé wọn tí wọ́n ń proof lélẹ́yìí. ohun tí wọ́n ní àwọn rí táwọn fi nígbàgbọ́ wípé àwọn lè dá create orílẹ̀-èdè nínú orílẹ̀-èdè just like that. agbòjọ́ òkè ń gbàjọ́ kan tì mi ò ní ka díẹ̀ níbẹ̀ kí n má ka díẹ̀ n tó gbé mi wá gangan nìyẹn and again mo fẹ́ kọ́ wọ̀n rẹ́kọ̀ lọ́jọ́ kí n fún ní topic lọ́tọ̀. Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí fake nation and United Nations Declaration wrong interpretation. Ntí Marcus Ìjìnlẹ̀ sọ lórí tó ń sọ̀rọ̀ lé lórí ni declaration and let me correct an impression. wọ́n ní bójú ìjọba ọba fọ́ tẹ́tí gọ́ọ̀mẹ̀ntì Nàìjíríà ò di àwọn ti pín lẹ́tà ní last year sí gbogbo ìpínlẹ̀ n tó fún ọ ní audacity láti nígbàgbọ́ pé àwọn lè create nation nìyẹn ìgbà tán ti mú lẹ́tà wá tẹ́ ti gbà lọ wọn. meanwhile àwọn tó gba lẹ́tà ò jẹ̀bi lóòótọ́ ni wọ́n mú lẹ́tà lọ sí government house nìbàdàn àwọn security gbà lọ wọn ẹ̀tọ́ tí wọ́n ní láti gba lẹ́tà because ẹni tó mú lẹ́tà wá tẹ́ ẹ bá lè gba lẹ́tà ó lè dìjà lẹ́tà yẹn lè má wá kọjá security post ó lè má mú fún kó ń bẹ̀ ṣùgbọ́n lọ́kàn àwọn dìndìnrìn tó kó lẹ́tà wá àwọn fọkàn sí pé àwọn ti mú lẹ́tà wá ó ti dọ́dọ̀ gọ́fúnọ̀ ẹ ṣe máa fún gómìnà ru lẹ́tà bẹ́ẹ̀ ta ni ó mú lọ and if I happen to be that governor ẹni tó mú lẹ́tà wá yẹn mo gbọ́dọ̀ dismiss ẹ̀ because máa béèrè wípé wọ́n mú ilé ọlọ́wọ́ ìwọ náà dẹ̀ mú bọ̀ wájú mi so lo number 6 ẹ̀ so ní initiative rárá I will surely say that. Now wọ́n sọ wípé àwọn ti mú lẹ́tà wá ń tà wọ́n nìyẹn àwọn dẹ̀ ti drop letter for anybody so ìgbésẹ̀ tọkàn ni pé káwọn ó declare nation nínú nation. ẹ jẹ́ kí n kọ́kọ́ fún ní declaration United Nations ilé tí ń bẹ lọ́wọ́ àwọn Marcus ìjìnlẹ̀. Declaration Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, General Assembly on 13 September 2007, without reference to a main committee bracket A/61/L.67 and add.1 bracket close bracket 61/295 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The General Assembly, taking note of the recommendation of the Human Rights Council contained in its resolution 1 and 2 of 29 June, say 261, okay, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, recalling its resolution 61/178 of 20th December of an action on the declaration to allow time for the further consultations thereon, and also decided to conclude its consideration before the end of 1 see official record blah 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 of the General Assembly 61st section supplement number 53 bracket A61/53 part 1 chap 2 section A1, by which the Council adopted the text of the United Nations 2006, okay, 2006 in November, tán lọ kọ 261, okay, by which it decided to defer consideration the 61st session of the General Assembly adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as contained in the annex to the present resolution. Sorry. Sorry, ẹ má bínú. Annex on the right of indigenous people, guided by the purposes and principles of the fulfillment of the obligations assumed by affirming that indigenous peoples are equal to all peoples to be different, to consider themselves, affirming also that all people contribute to the which constitute the common heritage of HU2. Okay o, bóyá orúmọ́ra wọn ni o. 107th plenary meeting United Nations Declaration, the General Assembly 13 September, Charter of the United Nations, and good faith states in accordance with the Charter other peoples, while recognizing the right of all different and to be respected as such diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures mankind, affirming further that all doctrines, policies and practices based on or advocating superiority of people or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial religion. Now tẹ́ bá wò dáadáa ní tí wọ́n pè ní right of indigenous people òun náà ni wọ́n ti ń state sílẹ̀ yìí o, richness of civilization and cultures tó jẹ mọ́ ti indigenous people. Kò sí ẹ̀yà region kan, ilẹ̀ kan tí ò ní àṣà tiwọn lọ́tọ̀, tí ò ní ẹ̀sìn tí wọ́n sìn, tí ò ní policy, affirming further that all doctrines, policies and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust, reaffirming that indigenous peoples in the exercise of their rights should be free from discrimination of any kind. tán bá sọ pé the indigenous people should be free from discrimination of any kind, kò túmọ̀ sí wípé káwọn indigenous people gan wá gbà wípé àwọn lè gbéra wọn kúrò nínú nation tán wà bọ́ sínú míì just like that. Concerned that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustice as a result of inter alia their colonization and dispossession of their lands, territories and resources, thus preventing them from exercising in particular their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. tẹ́ bá wo dáadáa máa rí i pé ignorance ń dà wọ́n láàmú. èwo ni wọ́n fi deny Yorùbá region, Yorùbá ethnic nínú gbogbo tán kà sílẹ̀ yìí. Right from day one tí Nàìjíríà ti exist ní Yorùbá ti ní representation in everything. ìjọ tí Yorùbá ò bá jẹ president, Yorùbá will rather be vice president or senate president or speaker of the House of Representatives. kò sígbà torílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà wà tọ́mọ Yorùbá wà sí ní 1 to 4th position. So why tí Yorùbá wà ní right to their development in accordance with their own needs and interests? Why ẹni ní senatorial district yín ẹni senator tó ń represent interest yín in the National Assembly ní constituency yín ẹni House of Rep members tó ń represent yín ní constituency yín ẹni state governor ní local government yín ẹni member of the House of Assembly ní state yín ẹni representative ní local government yín. Báwo náà ṣe wá ń deny yín ní development? àwọn tí wọ́n bá ń fìyà jẹ làwọn tí wọ́n ò jẹ́ kán participate rárá. àwọn yẹn ló lè push fún ìjọba tàbí orílẹ̀-èdè wọn, and tí ẹ̀yà gangan bá wá jókòó rò ó, that is àwọn bá máa involve, àwọn olóṣèlú máa involve, àwọn àgbà, àwọn ọ̀jọ̀gbọ́n, àwọn ọ̀mọ̀wé, àwọn nǹkan, àwọn agbẹjọ́rò, àwọn onímọ̀ ìjìnlẹ̀ nínú òfin wọ́n involve. kì í ṣe pé àwọn riffraff kankan máa kóra wọn jọ lẹ́gbẹ̀ẹ́ kan wọ́n wá láwọn fẹ́ gba nation fún gbogbo wa. Does that make any sense? Needs and interest. Recognizing the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of indigenous people. Ta ló tún fẹ́ represent wa? Ta ló ṣẹ̀ṣẹ̀ fẹ́ respect wa? Sáwa gangan respect ara wa. èyí tẹ́lẹ̀ ń bèrè fún Yorùbá nation, gbogbo ọba ilẹ̀ Yorùbá lẹ ti bú tán, gbogbo àwọn àgbààgbà wa lẹ ti ṣépè fún tán, gbogbo àwọn olóṣèlú lẹ ti kàn lábùkù tán, which derive from their political, economic and social structures and from their cultures. My dear brothers and sisters, ẹ̀yin ọmọ ẹ̀yin Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí àti Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí fúnra lára ẹ̀ ẹ wá síbi ẹ jẹ́ ká lecture yín. Indigenous people as Yoruba people we are always involved in political dispensation tó bá wáyé ní Nàìjíríà. Economically are involved, social structure are involved. Kò dẹ̀ sẹ́ni tó dí wa lọ́wọ́ láti practice culture wa. Spiritual traditions ló jẹ́ ká allow every religion láti exist. Bí Muslim ṣe ń kírun ni Christian lọ church, làwọn ológun ń bọ̀gún, làwọn eléṣù ń bèṣù, làwọn eléégún ń gbéégún, làwọn olóró ń sọ̀rọ̀. Spiritual traditions, histories and philosophies. Ìtàn wa ń bẹ́ńbẹ́ níwọ̀nba tó ṣẹ́kù. A ní philosophy wa, especially their right to their lands. Alẹ́tọ̀ wa sílẹ̀ wa. Kò sẹ́ni tó wá látòkè ọya tó wá gbalẹ̀ wa, kò sẹ́ni tó wá láti ilẹ̀ Ìgbò tó wá gbalẹ̀ wa. They would rather buy it from us. Ẹ̀yin lẹ́ ń talẹ̀ fẹ́ tó wù yín. Ọmọ Ìgbò ti ra lẹ̀ Èkó tán, wọ́n ti ra lẹ̀ Ìbàdàn tán, wọ́n ti ra lẹ̀ Ẹ̀gbá tán, wọ́n ti ra lẹ̀ Ọ̀ṣun tán, wọ́n ti ra lẹ̀ Oǹdó tán, wọ́n ti ra tẹ̀ Èkìtì tán. Àwọn ọ̀dẹ̀já talẹ̀ fún non-indigene lọ́dọ̀ wọn. Their right to their lands, territories and resources. That is, tá a bá fẹ́ ní right sí resources wa, that means we go back to regional government. Ìgbà yẹn a máa ní access sí resources wa, a máa lè manage ẹ̀ kán di agbára central kù. Àjókòó sọ gbọ́dọ̀ wà fún yẹn. Ẹnìkan kò lè déédéé jókòó sí arabi kan kó sọ pé ó ń ṣe yẹn fún wa. Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples affirmed in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements with states. Can you imagine that? Ignorance, I said, is a big disease, huge disease. Ọgbọ́n nǹkan tán sọ. Recognizing also the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of the indigenous people affirmed in treaties. Kí náà ń pè ní treaties? Ìpíhùn, àsọyépọ̀, agreement ní tàjẹ́ fọnú kò lé lórí. Another constructive arrangement with states. That is, any arrangement with the country that you are in. Tán bá ń sọ pé states, wọ́n ń sọ̀rọ̀ nípa orílẹ̀-èdè. Welcoming the fact that the indigenous peoples are organizing themselves for political, economic, social and cultural enhancement. So gbọ́ dáadáa Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí, so gbọ́ dáadáa Mákọ́ọ̀sì. Welcoming the fact that indigenous peoples are organizing themselves for political, economic, social and cultural enhancement, and in order to bring to an end all forms of discrimination and oppression where they occur. Nobody is oppressing Yoruba people. Nobody can physically oppress us in any way. Tí wọ́n bá oppress wa stylishly, tá a bá accept yẹ, so shall it be. Tí wọ́n bá oppress wa, tá a bá reject yẹ, so shall it be. So, convinced that control by indigenous peoples over developments affecting them and their lands, territories and resources will enable them to maintain and strengthen their institutions, cultures and traditions, and to promote their development in accordance with their aspirations and needs. Recognizing that respect for indigenous knowledge, culture and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment, emphasizing the contribution of the demilitarization of the lands and territories of indigenous peoples to peace, economic and social progress and development, understanding and friendly relations among nations and peoples of the world, recognizing in particular the right of indigenous families and communities to retain, share responsibility for the upbringing, training, education and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of the child. Ntáwọn Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí nígbàgbọ́ wípé bọ́n ṣe sọ yìí, àwọn ní ráìtì láti kéde sovereign state so that àwọn máa train ọmọ àwọn, máa fún wọn lẹ́dúkéṣàn bọ́ bá ṣe wù àwọn. Torí ẹ̀ náà ṣe kéde wípé àwọn ti gbogbo iléèwé pa, àwọn comedian wèrè. Considering that the rights affirmed in treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements between states and indigenous people, kò tí ì sí arrangement kankan láàrin àwa àti state, kò tí ì sí àjọsọyépọ̀ kankan láàrin àwa àti country, láàrin àwa àti president ń bẹ lóde. So kí ló fún yín ní audacity? Ẹ̀ ń kàwé lásán, ẹ̀ ń hàtìlé lórí. Ẹ dìdìrín pọ̀ o. Okay. Other constructive arrangements between state and indigenous peoples are, in some situations, matters of international concern, interest, responsibility and character, considering also that treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements and the relationship they represent. Relationship that represent pẹ̀lú Nigeria ni pé we are still part and parcel of Nigeria state until tí gbogbo wa bá sọ pé à ń lọ lọ́tọ̀ọ̀tọ̀ are the basis for a strengthened partnership between indigenous people and state. ẹ rí i pé wọ́n sọ pé kí indigenous people kọ́ kẹ́rù wọn jáde kúrò nínú state. ní tí bá ń dùn indigenous people lọ́kàn tí wọ́n wò pé ọ̀dọ̀ wa lẹ ti ń rí revenue, ọ̀dọ̀ wa lẹ ti ń generate revenue, ọ̀dọ̀ wa lẹ ti ń rí tax, ọ̀dọ̀ wa lẹ ti ń rí nǹkan kan intent fún wa kéré. ẹ já jókòó ẹ bá wa increase ẹ bí ọba ṣe increase ẹ já fún aláǹfààní ká máa manage nǹkan wa á máa san iye báyìí fún yín. ìyẹn ò túmọ̀ sí pé orílẹ̀-èdè lè jáde kúrò nínú orílẹ̀-èdè just like that. Never, it can never happen. Acknowledging that the Charter of the United Nations, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 2 of Action 3. As well as the Vienna Declaration and Program affirm the fundamental importance of the right of the right to self-determination of all peoples, by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development, bearing in mind that nothing in this declaration may be used to deny any peoples their right to self-determination exercised in conformity with international law. Modupe Onitiri and Co. Marcus Ejele should come forward to tell us under which international law ni wọ́n fi exercise in tí wọ́n pè ní right wọn tí wọ́n fi believe pé àwọn lè declare nation out of nation, nation out of country just like that. Kí wọ́n wá jáde sọ fún wa nbí tí Nàìjíríà ti agree pé okay agree ẹ jẹ́ ká máa lọ wàhálà wọn tiẹ̀ ti pọ̀ jù. Àbí wọ́n máa ń gbàlú lẹ́yìn onílù ni sàn máa ń fàlú yọ. Láńlọ́ọ̀dù lè gba tẹ́nàntì lé nísìn kí tẹ́nàntì ó wá tó fi yàrá tó ṣòfò míì rẹ́ǹtì fara àta láì sọ fún láńlọ́ọ̀dù. So possible. Convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous people in this declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the states and the indigenous people. Ta ló ń bá àwọn èèyàn ronú ta ní ń bá wọn interpret nǹkan tán interpret. Convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous people ní ìdánimọ̀ ẹ̀tọ́ àwọn tí wọ́n jẹ́ ọmọ òun lé nẹ̀ gangan o in this declaration o nínú declaration tá a ṣe o we as harmonious àjọṣepọ̀ tó dán mọ́rán cooperative relations between the state and the indigenous people kájọṣepọ̀ tó dán mọ́rán ó lè wà lẹ́yìn láàrin ẹ̀yin tẹ́jọ́ ọmọ onílùú àtàwọn tí ń ṣèjọba lórí yín ẹ̀yin wá jẹ lọ́nà bíi ntẹ̀dẹ̀ ń rí lọ́dọ̀ wa kì í ṣe kéré mi ntẹ̀ ń rí lọ́dọ̀ wa pọ̀ ju àǹfààní tá à ń jẹ lọ́dọ̀ yín lọ bí wọ́n ṣe ń pín revenue country yìí ó base lórí in tí wọ́n ń generate láti state kọ̀ọ̀kan wọ́n fọ̀tẹ̀ pín àwọn míì wọ́n fi sentiment pín àwọn míì àwọn tó ń fi sentiment pín tiwọn tí as a student tí teacher tàbí lecturer bá máàkì ìwé ẹ tó dá ọ lójú pọ̀ mọ́ ọdẹ gbá tó bá máàkì ẹ tí ò máàkì ẹ dá ẹ̀tọ́ ẹgbẹ́wé rẹ lọ bá teacher ẹskísà ẹ wo iṣẹ́ tí mo ṣe ẹ wo ilé ìta Awíkonko ṣe wáì tí Awíkonko fi máa gbàjú mi lọ pẹ̀lú nǹkan tó kọ yẹn gẹ́gẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ ní region tí ó bá rí pé wọn ò represent òun dáadáa tàbí pé wọ́n yàn wọ́n jẹ wọ́n lè approach anybody any government with mutual respect responsibly democratically and legally. Cooperative relations between the state and indigenous people based on principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination and good faith. Good faith ò sínú nǹkan tẹ́ gbé wá. Principle of justice, democracy. We are in times of democracy. Ntẹ́ gbé wá kò í jẹ jáde nínú democracy. Anarchy lè fẹ́ create yẹn. Non-discrimination and good faith encouraging states to comply with and effectively implement all their obligations. Kí náà pè ní obligations? Àkíyèsí yín tẹ́ fi rò pé wọ́n yàn yín jẹ. Oríṣiríṣi ọ̀nà tẹ́ gbà pé wọ́n fi yàn yín jẹ ẹ ti state ẹ̀. Ẹ máa wá encourage president tàbí àwọn executive council tàbí the country pé kí wọ́n bá ń wò ṣe kí wọ́n fún yín ní consideration. At least tó bá jẹ́ nǹkan 100 lẹ́wọ́n bèèrè lọ́wọ́ government lè wò wọ́n lè jókòó gbé president àáyàn àwọn èèyàn jẹ́ lóòótọ́ o ń tà rí lọ́dọ̀ wọn pọ̀ o lọ́dọọdún lóṣooṣù iye tá a rí January ní tá a rí February lélẹ̀ ń tà fún wọn lélẹ̀ sòótọ́ ni o àwa lè fún ọ ní ìtàn béèrè but at least ẹ já increase comply with and effectively implement all their obligations as they apply to indigenous people under international instruments, in particular those related to human rights, in consultation and cooperation with the peoples concerned. In consultation, ẹ consult, and cooperation, ẹ fọwọ́sowọ́pọ̀. Wọ́n ò sọ pé kẹ́ ẹ kọ̀yìn sí ìjọba tí ń bẹ lóde. Wọ́n ò sọ pé kẹ́ ẹ lọ dájọba tí ń kalẹ̀ just like that. And in tó dùn mí dùn bẹ́ẹ̀ ni pé those people are educated, but I call them educated illiterate. Now emphasizing that the United Nations has an important and continued role to play in promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous people, believing that this declaration is a further important step forward for the recognition, promotion and protection of the rights and freedom of indigenous peoples in the development of relevant activities of the United Nations systems in this field. Recognition and reaffirming that indigenous individuals are entitled without discrimination to all human rights recognized in the international law, and that indigenous people possess collective rights, not personal life, not personal rights, collective rights which are indispensable for their existence, well-being and integral development as people. Kì í ṣe Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí ni ó wà ní kọ́nà kan ni ó máa sọ̀rọ̀ on our behalf, tàbí nonentity kan tó pe rẹ̀ ní Marcus ni ó believe pé ó wà on top of the world máa wá decide fún wa. Ó wà ridiculous lórílẹ̀‐èdè tá ti ní more than 30, 40, 50 million people. Tọ́jọ̀gbọ́n tí ń bẹ nínú ẹ̀ ò ṣeé kà, accountant tó wà nínú ẹ̀ ò ṣeé kà, doctor tó wà nínú ẹ̀ ò ṣeé kà, lawyers tó wà nínú ẹ̀ ò ṣeé kà, justice tó wà nínú ẹ̀ ò ṣeé kà. Àwọn kan máa dédé jókòó sí kọ̀rọ̀ kan wọ́n wá láwọn ń decide fún wa. Does that make any sense? Possess collective rights which are indispensable for their existence, well-being and integral development as peoples. Recognizing that the situation of indigenous peoples varies from region to region, can you imagine, and from country to country, and that the significance of national and regional particularities and various historical and cultural backgrounds should be taken into consideration. Wọ́n sọ pé kẹ́ jáde kó lórílẹ̀‐èdè, mutual relationship, mutual agreement ó gbọ́dọ̀ wà láàrin ẹ̀yin àti state. Solemnly proclaims the following United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a standard of achievement to be pursued in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. Èmi kọ́ ọmọ kọ́ United Nations ló kọ́. And mutual respect in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. What kind of partnership are you intend to have with Nigeria? Pẹ̀lú agitation yín, ẹ̀yin mélòó lẹ wà ńbẹ̀? Èèyàn mélòó ló support yín? Can you do it alone? No. Article 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals, of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in international human rights law. Article 2. Indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals, and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular based on their indigenous origin or identity. Ta ni ń bọ ọjà side identity ẹ? Ta ló sọ fún Dúpẹ́ pé kì í sọmọ Èkó? Ta ló sọ fẹ́mi pé mi ì sọmọ Ọ̀ṣun? Ta ló sọ fún Ṣèyí Mákindé pé kì í sọmọ Ìbàdàn? Article 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. That is, within the same government, within the same country. Tó bá máa wá jẹ́ outside the country, níta àjọsopọ̀ àjọ máa wá jókòó láti pín. Article 4. Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. Gbogbo eléyìí ten misinterpret kò tí ì túmọ̀ sí secession, kò tí ì túmọ̀ sí nation out of nation. We can equally have self-autonomous within Nigeria. Back to regional government, parliamentary system is as equal as have self-autonomous state, autonomous function, because by then a ti máa ní access sí resources wa fúnra wa, a máa generate ẹ̀ fúnra wa, a máa utilize ẹ̀ fúnra wa. Article 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. State dan sọ refer sí country tẹ́ wà to participate fully while retaining their rights. That means wọ́n lè mú ìgbòòrò ìrólágbára bá distinct political wọn, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions. Láàrin ilé wa a lè generate owó wa, a lè utilize ẹ̀ lórí òṣèlú, a lè ṣòṣèlú láàrin ilé wa nínú region wa, a lè hold election, a máa ní olórí adájọ́ àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Tó bá dẹ̀ tún wò wá tá bá fẹ́ participate nínú politics state lápapọ̀, that is láàrin wa fẹ́ lọ sí prime minister, láàrin wa fẹ́ lọ sí minister, láàrin wa fẹ́ lọ sí national assembly, a lè participate ńbẹ̀. Wọ́n sọ pé dandan ká jáde kúrò ní Nàìjíríà. Article 6. Every indigenous individual has the right to a nationality. Article 7. 1. Indigenous individuals have the right to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty and security of person. 2. Indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. Eléyìí tẹ́ ń lọ yìí ṣe violence kọ́. Article 8. 1. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Sẹ́ẹ̀tì ìpàṣà irun tẹ́lẹ̀tẹ́lẹ̀. 2. States shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for a. Any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as distinct peoples or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. B. Any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories, or resources. C. Any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. D. Any form of forced assimilation or integration. E. Any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. Article 9. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to belong to an indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. Within that nation, no discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such rights. Article 10. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned and after agreement on just and fair compensation and where possible with the option of return. Mi rò pé yẹn lè wáyé láéláé as in kí gọ́ọ̀mẹ̀ntì kan wá pé ẹ̀yin tẹ́ wà nílé Ifẹ̀ o a fẹ́ mú fún yín kúrò ní Ilé Ifẹ̀ o a mú fún yín lọ sílẹ̀ tuntun fún ìdí báyìí fún ìdí báyìí fún ìdí báyìí a máa wá dá yín padà nígbà tó bá dàsìkò báyìí. That will never happen. Nǹkan tí wọ́n dẹ̀ ń rí fáàsì níbẹ̀ yẹn nu where possible with the option of return. Article 11. Indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. And as far as I'm concerned, kò sẹ́ni tó deny wa ní gbogbo eléyìí. Àwọn bí tá a rí gẹ́gẹ́ bí kí náà pé okay like wọ́n ní past, present, and future. Kí làwọn ìṣẹ̀ṣe tá a dáyé bá ń tá a dáyé ṣe táwọn baba ńlá baba wa ìyá ńlá ìyá wa fi ilẹ̀ fún wa. Present eléyìí tá à ń ṣe lọ́wọ́ báwo la ṣe ń prepare future ẹ̀yà wa ó wà stake. Manifestation of their cultures àṣà wa ń bẹ ń bẹ àwa kọ̀ọ̀kan ṣe ń practice ẹ̀ èyí kan rí gẹ́gẹ́ bí tó ti wà outdated such as archaeological and historic sites. Ọ̀ṣun Òṣogbo wa ń bẹ ń bẹ à ń celebrate ẹ̀ lọ́dọọdún. Ìkọgùsì waterfall ń bẹ ń bẹ ẹ̀rìjìyàn àbí kí lórúkọ ti Ìkọgùsì spring water Ìkọgùsì waterfall ẹ̀rìjìyàn spring water àbí ìkànsánú méjèèjì Ẹ̀rìn-Ìjẹ̀ṣà waterfall náà wà ń bẹ. Gbogbo àwọn bíi tá a rí gẹ́gẹ́ bíi tourist center ó wà nílẹ̀ wa ẹnìkan kò dínà yẹ àwọn ibi tó yẹ ká mú gbòòrò bá àwọn ibi tó yẹ ká fẹ̀ lójú àfẹ́ lójú àwọn ibi tó yẹ kó jápè wá wò àjẹ́ kó jápè wá wò àwọn ibi tó yẹ ká tún ṣe kó attract international communities international tourists. Àṣẹ bẹ́ẹ̀ technology wa ń bẹ ń bẹ eléyìí tó jẹ́ látọwọ́ wa àwọn ceremonies gbogbo ọdún tá a máa ń ṣe lọ́dọọdún ọdún ìjẹsù ọdún ìlàsù ọdún ọlọ́jọ́ ọdún ajé ọdún èdì ọdún eégún ọdún orò ọdún ẹ̀yọ̀ ọdún kọmọló olóòlù àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ gbogbo ẹ̀ ló ń wáyé literature wa exist gbogbo tàwọn ìṣẹ̀dálẹ̀ wa ń ló ń bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ bìbà kò sẹ́ni tó yọ kúrò wáyì tẹ́ ẹ fẹ́ yọ kúrò lára Nàìjíríà kí nìdí pàtàkì ẹ jẹ́ á mọ̀. 2. States shall provide redress through effective mechanisms which may include restitution developed in conjunction with the indigenous people. In conjunction with indigenous people. Nbọ̀lẹ̀ tí wàá rí kàwé pọ́n sọ pé dandan kẹ́ ẹ jáde kúrò nínú orílẹ̀-èdè tẹ́ wà with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. Any president ò lè déédéé wá pé kán mọ́ sólóòlù mọ́ nìbàdàn. Any president kò lè dórí àlééfà kó sọ pé ká mọ́ sọdún ọlọ́jọ́ máa ń fẹ̀. Kò sẹ́ni tó máa change ọjọ́ tá à ń ṣe ọdún ajé. Kò sí president tó máa ní kán má sọdún Ọ̀ṣun Òṣogbo. Àwọn tó nílùú ń ló lè sọ pé àwọn ò ṣe. So where are we going? Àwọn tán pè ní right of indigenous people lélẹ́yìí kì í ṣe secession. Article 12:1 indigenous people have the right to manifest, practice, develop and teach their spiritual and religious tradition. Sẹ́ni gangan stop wa ni. Elégúngún ń ṣe gúngún, olóró ń sorò, ọlọ́bàtálá ń sọ bàtálá, ọlọ́sùn ń sọ̀sùn. Àwọn tó dẹ̀ ń kọ́, àwọn tí ń kọ́ kéwú, àwọn tí ń lọ sí Bible schools lọ, kò sẹ́ni tó disturb anybody. Religious traditions, customs and ceremonies, mo ti sọ bẹ́ẹ̀ lẹ́ẹ̀kan, the right to maintain, protect and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites. Lọ́dọọdún náà ń lọ Mẹ́kà, lọ́dọọdún ni wọ́n ń lọ Jerusalem. Ẹ̀mélòó làwa ti lọ sójú bọ Ọbàtálá tàbí t'Ọ̀rúnmìlà. Mo fi yẹn ṣàwẹ́wà ni lélẹ̀ tó túmọ̀ sí pé kò sẹ́ni tó disturb anybody. Bó bá jẹ́ pé lẹ̀mí máa ń bẹ fáwọn onífá náà kí wọ́n máa lọ. The right to the use and control of their ceremonial objects and their right of the repatriation of their human remains. Ceremonial objects. Ntọ́lọ́dún kọ̀ọ̀kan ń lò fọ́dún ẹ̀ náà ni wọ́n ń lò, kò sẹ́ni tó stop wọn. 2. States shall seek to enable the access and or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with the indigenous people concerned. Article 13:1 indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, written systems and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places and persons. Ṣé mo sá wà online? Ṣé mo sá ń flow? Okay, network yẹn ó sì better. So, retain their own names for communities and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places and persons. Ìta òrùntọ́, òrótó, ìta akọgun, ó wà nílé Ifẹ̀ o. Kò sẹ́ni tí ó gbà sókun ní Ọ̀yọ́. Kò sẹ́ni tí ó change Mọ́níyà. Kò sẹ́ni tí ó change Ọ̀jọ́. Kò sẹ́ni tí ó yọ Agodi kúrò. Kò sẹ́ni tí ó yọ Basọ̀run kúrò. Kò sẹ́ni tí ó yọ Ògùnpa kúrò. Gbogbo tán pè ní right lélẹ́yìí. Ẹnìkan kò lè déédéé lọ́la kó sọ pé Ìwórodù jẹ́ Ìwórodù mọ́. Tó bá máa change orúkọ ìsídà kí wọ́n fi respect ìkan nínú àwọn akọni ilẹ̀ Yorùbá tó ti dágbére fáyé. Bẹ́ẹ̀ Ìwórodù afẹ́ change ẹ̀ sí Awólọ́wọ̀ road. Ó possible. Right of indigenous people nìyẹn. Number 2, state shall take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected and also ensure that indigenous people can understand and be understood in political, legal and administrative proceedings where necessary through the provision of interpretation or by other appropriate means. Gbọ́ nǹkan tán sọ ní number 2 yẹn, only states shall take effective measures to ensure that the right is protected and also to ensure that indigenous people can understand. Wọ́n sọ pé kẹ́ yọ kúrò lára state with that. You still remain part and parcel of that state. Article 14. Number 1, indigenous people have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. So shall it be o. Lóòótọ́ system ta fi ń tí education wa base lé lórí ó jẹ́ overall system, that is national system. The same subject ni wọ́n ń kọ́ here and there. Lo and behold, tẹ́lẹ̀tẹ́lẹ̀ nígbà tá a wà ní regional government tá a tiẹ̀ ti ní state gan nílẹ̀ Yorùbá èdè Yorùbá ni wọ́n fi ń kọ́ ní almost every subject during our primary education period. Èmi lè rántí dáadáa bó ṣe rí nìyẹn. Láyé ìgbà yẹn ni free education wà ní south west. Kò tí ì sọ́sùn gbà yẹn, Ọ̀yọ́ ni gbogbo àjọ wà. Big note exercise book ọ̀fẹ́ ni. Ìwé táǹkà ní school ọ̀fẹ́ ni. Nígbà yẹn ṣùgbọ́n ọ̀nà tí wọ́n ń gbà kọ́ wa èdè Yorùbá ni ó jẹ́ olórí èdè tí wọ́n fi ń kọ́ wa ní gbogbo ìwé ní gbogbo subject nígbà yẹn. Now tá a bá padà sí regional government, we can also and equally adopted that system. 2, indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all level and forms of education of the state without discrimination. Yes, bó ṣe rí náà nìyẹn o. Haúsá wá kàwé lẹ̀ Yorùbá, ọmọ Yorùbá ń lọ kàwé ní Zaria, wọ́n wà ní Delta State University, wọ́n wà ní Port Harcourt, wọ́n wà ní Benin. Ọmọ Yíbò ń bẹ ní OAU, wọ́n wà ní UI nìbàdàn, wọ́n wà ní University of Lagos. So exactly bó ṣe rí fún indigenous people náà nìyẹn without discrimination. 3, states shall in conjunction with indigenous peoples take effective measures in order for indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access when possible to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. Fine, ó lè wáyé bẹ́ẹ̀ ṣùgbọ́n nítorí pé kò sí àjọsọyépọ̀ lórílẹ̀‐èdè Nàìjíríà kò jọ wáyé bẹ́ẹ̀. Kò sí iléèwé nílẹ̀ Yorùbá tí ó ní tíjà fún Ìgbò, tí ó ní tíjà fún Hausa language. Kò sí iléèwé lókè ọya tí wọ́n ní tíjà fún Yorùbá lókè ọya, tí wọ́n ní tíjà fún Ìgbò, yàtọ̀ sí private schools. Àní nǹkan tí United Nations sọ ń bì báyìí ìnípò yẹ kó wà bẹ́ẹ̀. Because as far as I'm concerned, ńgbà tá a wà ní secondary school, Yorùbá language is a compulsory subject. Lélẹ̀ tó túmọ̀ sí pé ọmọ Yíbò tí bá ń bẹ láàrin wa ó ní right láti ṣe subject ẹ̀. Ó dàbí ẹni pé bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí ńgbà yẹn. Àwọn tó ń sa Hausa language wọ́n á dẹ̀ choose ẹ̀ compulsory subject. Ìyẹn ni kì í jẹ́ kéèyàn pàdánù èdè ẹ̀ ní ìjẹ́ ká gbàgbé èdè wa. Article 15. Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. 2. States shall take effective measures in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples concerned to combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination, and to promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations among indigenous peoples and all other segments of the society. Article 16. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish their own media in their own languages and to have access to all forms of non-indigenous media without discrimination. That is how it is in Yoruba land today. Name many radio stations, many television stations. Wọ́n ṣe news ní Yorùbá, wọ́n ṣe news ní English, wọ́n ṣe news ní pidgin. Láwọn radio and television stations láwọn state kan lẹ̀ Yorùbá wọ́n ṣe Igbo program, wọ́n ṣe Hausa programs. so gbogbo yẹn ti wà in place already. 2. States shall take effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect indigenous cultural diversity. States, without prejudice to ensuring full freedom of expression, should encourage privately owned media to adequately reflect indigenous cultural diversity. Very well. That is how it is presently. If you want to own a radio station or a television station, you must promote every indigenous languages. You must promote every religious activities. Kì í ṣe pé káwọn oníṣẹ̀ṣe ó dé kàn sọ pé rédíò wa yìí promote ẹ o, àwọn ò lè bá ń polówó ẹ o, irọ́ o, ò lè ní rédíò station o. You give them equal right. Equal right tó fún Christian ló máa fún Muslim ló máa fún àwọn traditionalist. Ìyẹn ti wà effective tẹ́lẹ̀tẹ́lẹ̀. Ìyẹn òun ṣe rísì tá a fẹ́ fi sọ pé a fẹ́ jáde kúrò lára Nàìjíríà. Okay. Article 17. 1. Indigenous individuals and peoples have the right to enjoy fully all rights established under applicable international and domestic labor law. 2. States shall in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples take specific measures to protect indigenous children from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral and social development, taking into account their special vulnerability and the importance of education for their empowerment. Very well. Ṣùgbọ́n torí àìríkànṣe kan lórílẹ̀‐èdè Nàìjíríà tí ọ̀jà lè yanra ìyẹn lè mọ́ wà into place. Bóyá ń gbà tá a bá dájọba padà sí regional government á láǹfààní láti bójútó yẹn. 3. Indigenous individuals have the right not to be subjected to any discriminatory conditions of labour and inter alia employment or salary. Irọ́ o eléyìí ò lè ṣẹlẹ̀ ní Nàìjíríà báyìí o. Kò sẹ́ni tó fẹ́ control salary fẹ́ nìkan. Tí n bá níṣẹ́ tí n bá gbéṣẹ́ kalẹ̀ yìí tí n bá lágbára láti san ni wọ́n san. Tá a bá padà sí regional government that should be that ìyẹn lè wà ní under control. Article 18. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision making in matters which will affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision making institutions. Eléyìí ni mo fi bẹ̀rẹ̀ ọ̀rọ̀ mi. Lélẹ̀ tó túmọ̀ sí wípé as indigenous people a ní representative ní every corner of government. Níbo náà ti wá state ẹ̀ wípé kí indigenous people tó bá ti jẹ́ indigenous people ó ti dorílẹ̀-èdè náà nu kọ́dẹ̀ jáde kúrò ní country tó bá ti wà. Àwọn èèyàn wọ̀nyí ò lórí pípé rárá. Well pápápá Article 19 kò ṣeé gé. Mo ti sọ fún kí n tó bẹ̀rẹ̀ pé mi ò lè stop ẹ̀ láàrin mi ì lè gé mo gbọ́dọ̀ kásá kó lè wọ̀n record. Eléyìí táwọn base lé lórí lélẹ̀ o mi ì tí ì ka eléyìí tó jẹ́ pé ó sọ reality nǹkan gangan o. Okay. Article 19. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Gẹ́gẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí. Àwọn tó wà nílé ìgbìmọ̀ asòfin àgbà ni wọ́n gbé nǹkan yẹ̀wò àti ilé ìgbìmọ̀ aṣojú ṣòfin ni wọ́n gbé nǹkan yẹ̀wò kan tó fọwọ́ sí kó tó di mímọ́ lò. Ó lè má fi fọ̀ wá ṣùgbọ́n wọ́n jọ ń jókòó ní kì í ṣe pé wọ́n yọ sẹ́nitọ̀ tó wá láti South West sẹ́gbẹ́ kan pé irọ́ ẹ̀yìn ẹ̀ kọ́kọ́ bọ́ taná àwa fẹ́ sọ̀rọ̀ kan. Article 20. 1. Indigenous people have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. 2. Indigenous people deprived of their means of subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair redress. Bẹ́ẹ̀ bá ti ń fẹ̀tọ́ wọn dùn wọ́n tẹ́lẹ̀ ẹ ṣàtúnṣe ntí yẹn túmọ̀ sí nìyẹn. Article 21. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right without discrimination to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, including inter alia in the areas of education, employment, vocational training and retraining, housing, sanitation, health and social security. 2. States shall take effective measure and where appropriate special measures to ensure continuing improvement of their economic and social conditions. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. Article 22. 1. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of this declaration. Right of indigenous people ni wọ́n ń sọ, kì í ṣe right of secession. 2. States shall take measures in conjunction with indigenous people to ensure that indigenous women children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. Kánmọ́yàwó obìnrin lẹ́yìn jẹ́, excuse me, kì í ṣe pé káwọn ẹ̀yà kan wá kán làwọn ọmọ yín lòkulò kán làwọn obìnrin yín lòkulò kí wọ́n tẹ òfin lójúmọ́lẹ̀. Article 23. Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In particular, indigenous peoples have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them, and as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institution. Article 24. 1. Indigenous people have the right to their traditional medicines and lo àgbo and to maintain their health practices and lo ọ̀dọ̀ oníṣègùn ìbílẹ̀ wa o, including the conservation of their vital medical plants and gbewé and gbegbo wa, animals and minerals and jẹran ìgbẹ́ wa dáadáa o. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access without any discrimination to all social and health services. 2. Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. States shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of this right. Article 25. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Article 26. 1. Indigenous people have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, and otherwise used or acquired. Ẹ̀báyẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí. 2. Indigenous people have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. 3. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous people concerned. Article 27. States shall establish and implement, in conjunction with indigenous people concerned, a fair, independent, impartial, open, and transparent process, giving due recognition to indigenous people's laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems, to recognize and adjudicate the right systems to recognize and adjudicate the rights of indigenous peoples pertaining to their land, territories, and resources, including those which were traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. Indigenous people shall have the right to participate in this process. Article 28. 1. Indigenous people have the right to redress by means that can include restitution or, when this is not possible, just fair and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. 2. Unless otherwise freely agreed upon by the peoples concerned, compensation shall take the form of land, territories, and resources equal in quality, size, or legal status, or of monetary compensation or other appropriate redress. Ìyẹn ò wáyé bẹ́ẹ̀. Gọ́ọ̀mẹ̀ntì dẹ̀ lọ́mọ bí wọ́n ṣe máa ń yàn wá jẹ bọ́n bá fẹ́ gbalẹ̀ wa. Bọ́n bá gbalẹ̀ nílùú kan nísìnyí, bọ́n bá jẹ́ monetary compensation náà fẹ́ fún wọn, owó péréte ní tó yẹ kán rà ní 500,000 wọ́n lè ra 50,000. Bọ́n bá dẹ̀ gbalẹ̀ yín tó jẹ́ 200 hectares náà gbà, wọ́n lè fún yín ní 20 hectares. Bíbi táwọn ti fẹ́ fún yín nílẹ̀ ilẹ̀ ọ̀pọ̀ ńbẹ̀. So ìyànjẹ́ lè wà ńbẹ̀ yẹn. Article 29. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of their environment and the productive capacity of their lands and territories and resources. States shall establish and implement assistance programs for indigenous peoples for such conservation and protection without discrimination. State lè ṣe dáadáa. Bàbá náwó rẹ̀ sí wọn. States shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. 3. States shall also take effective measures to ensure as needed that programs for monitoring, maintaining, and restoring the health of indigenous peoples as developed and implemented by the peoples affected by such materials are duly implemented. Article 30. 1. Military activities shall not take place in the lands or territory of the indigenous peoples unless justified by relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by indigenous peoples concerned. Kí wá ló dé tẹ̀yìn kọ́ ọmọ ogun wọlé? Orí yín ò dáa. 2. States shall undertake effective consultations with indigenous people concerned through appropriate procedures and in particular through their representative institutions prior to using their lands or territories for military activities. Article 31. Indigenous lè lọ ṣe fi pàgọ́ ibùdó ogun sí ilẹ̀ onílẹ̀. But ilẹ̀ kan náà lájọ wà. 1. Indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expression, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports, literatures, designs, sports, and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. Àti sọ́npa ìlẹ́ẹ̀kan, a ní literature tiwa, a ní tradition tiwa, a ní oral tradition tiwa. Lára ẹ̀ ní jálá wà, lára ẹ̀ ní ewì wà, lára ẹ̀ ní ẹkún ìyàwó wà, lára ẹ̀ ní rárá wà, lára ẹ̀ lẹ̀sà eégún wà, lára ẹ̀ ní bọ̀lọ̀jọ́ wà, lára ẹ̀ ní orin etí ẹ̀rí wà, lára ẹ̀ ní kíntúni o ìyẹ̀rẹ̀fá, lára ẹ̀ ní kíntúni o òkú pípé, oríṣiríṣi ńlọ wà. 2. In conjunction with indigenous peoples, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of this right. Article 32. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. 2. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to their approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization or exploitation of mineral, water or other resources. bá a bá lajúlẹ̀ tí wọ́n ń wa góòlù nílẹ̀ wa tí wọ́n wá tọ̀dọ̀ wọn, bá a bá lajúlẹ̀ tí wọ́n gba ìgbèrí òkú mọ́ wa lọ́wọ́, wàhálà tiwa nìyẹn. Number 3, states shall provide effective mechanisms for just and fair redress for any such activities, and appropriate measures shall be taken to mitigate adverse environmental, economic, social, cultural, and or spiritual impact. Article 33. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or memberships in accordance with their customs and tradition. This does not impair the right of indigenous individual to obtain citizenship of the state in which they live. Exactly bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí náà. ọmọ Ọ̀ṣun ò lè sọ pé torí pé òun jẹ́ ọmọ Nàìjíríà òun àìsàn ọmọ Ọ̀ṣun mọ́, tàbí kí Nàìjíríà sọ pé ó kọ́ táwùsá ń jẹ́ la gbọ́dọ̀ mọ́ sọmọ wa. Kò rí bẹ́ẹ̀ náà. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine the structures and to select the membership of their institutions in accordance with their home procedures. Bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí jàre. Article 34. Indigenous people have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures and their distinctive customs, spirituality, traditions, procedures, practices, and in cases where they exist, juridical systems or customs in accordance with the International Human Rights Standard. Article 35. Indigenous people have the right to determine the responsibilities of individuals of their communities. Okay? Article 36. 1. Indigenous peoples, in particular those divided by international borders, have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation, including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes with their own members as well as other peoples across borders. Bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí. Bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí. Haúsá ń gbélé Yorùbá, Yorùbá ń gbélé Yíbò. Gbogbo wa dẹ̀ respect culture wa, kò jù bẹ́ẹ̀ náà lọ. 2. States, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, shall take effective measures to facilitate the exercise and ensure the implementation of this right. Article 37. Indigenous peoples have the right to recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements, including the states of their successors, and to have state honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. 2. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating the rights of indigenous people contained in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. Article 38 states, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, shall take the appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration. Article 39. Indigenous peoples have the right to have access to financial and technical assistance from states and through international cooperation for the enjoyment of the rights contained in this declaration. Bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ló ṣe rí. Ìbá ń yáwó ní national, ìbá ń gọ́fúnà wa ń yáwó lókè òkun, àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Article 40. Indigenous peoples have the right to access to and prompt decision through just and fair procedures for the resolution of conflicts and disputes with states or other parties, as well as to effective remedies for all infringements of their individual and collective rights. Such a decision shall give due consideration to the customs, traditions, rules, and legal system of the indigenous peoples concerned and international human rights. Article 41. The organs and specialized agencies of the United Nations system and other intergovernmental organizations shall contribute to the full realization of the provisions of this declaration through the mobilization, inter alia, of financial cooperation and technical assistance, ways and means of ensuring participation of indigenous peoples on issues affecting them shall be established. Article 42. The United Nations, its bodies, including the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and specialized agencies, including at the country level and state, shall promote respect for and full application of the provisions of this declaration and follow up the effectiveness of this declaration. Article 43, the right recognized herein constitutes the minimum standard for the survival, dignity and well-being of indigenous people of the world. Wọ́n sọ pé kẹ́ ẹ jáde kúrò nínú orílẹ̀-èdè kan o. Article 44, all the rights and freedoms recognized therein are equally guaranteed to male and female indigenous individual. Article 45, nothing in this declaration may be construed as diminishing or extinguishing the rights indigenous people have now or may acquire in future. Article 46, 1. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations or construed and authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Can you imagine those òpònú tí wọ́n pera wọn ní tí wọ́n pera wọn lóní tìrí àtàwọn ọmọ ẹ̀yìn ẹ̀ declaration tí wọ́n interpret fúnra wọn ni yóò wrongly lọ́nà tó fi máa fẹ́ for propaganda wọn àwọn èèyàn dẹ̀ buy into it wọ́n dẹ̀ ń fò fáyọ̀ unnecessary lórí nǹkan tí ò ṣẹlẹ̀ tí ò lè ṣẹlẹ̀. Can you imagine? Ṣé kí n tún bẹ̀rẹ̀ kàlẹ́ kan sí nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. To engage in any activities wọ́n ti engage in bẹ́ẹ̀ or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember any activity tó lè mú wọn ya kúrò lára tó lè mú wọn má jẹ́ ọmọ orílẹ̀-èdè tán wà mọ́ or impair totally or in part bóyá gbogbogbò ni o àbí díẹ̀ péré nú ẹ̀ the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign political unity orílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà any activities tó bá máa mú àkùdé bá tó máa mú palára bá an independent state kò yẹ kéèyàn kankan engage inú ẹ̀ or group of people. Àwọn olómìnira dé yìí àwọn ní Yorùbá nation dé yìí they are just group of people non majority o wọ́n yìí ṣe minority gan wọ́n tó minority because our sovereignty should be determined by all of us in agreement. 2. In the exercise of the rights enunciated in the present declaration, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all shall be respected. Of course, gbogbo ani, the exercise of this right set forth in this declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law and in accordance with international human rights obligations. Any such limitations shall be non-discriminatory and strictly necessary solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for meeting the just and most compelling requirements of a democratic society. 3. The provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. I rise. So declaration ti àwọn onítìrí lélẹ́yìí tí wọ́n base lé lórí tí wọ́n fi sọ wípé àwọn fẹ́ create nation nínú nation. So now you will now have the normal interpretation of United Nations Declaration. Ṣé àwọn gbọ́dọ̀ sọ pé tí wọ́n ọ̀tọ̀ ilé ìtẹ́mi mú wá ọ̀tọ̀. Sorry o. Wow, mo ti lò 1 hour 15 minutes ẹ ti rí pé kò ṣeé join mọ́ program tàkọ́kọ́ but ó necessary ó dẹ̀ wà very very essential fún mi láti ṣe not because of today but because of tomorrow torí pé àwọn kan máa dé lọ́la wọ́n máa wá rí wọn gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹni tó ń jà fáwọn wọ́n rà wá gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹni tí ò gbé gbèsè kankan fáwọn kan tó mọ̀ pé rọ́ǹgì gbèsè náà ń gbé àwa tá ń sọ̀rọ̀ ni wọ́n máa rí gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹni tó ń takù wọn tàbí against wọn tàbí takù wọn. That is the reason why tí gbogbo kìíní ìfi necessary ẹ fún mi ìṣẹ́jú méjì péré kí n wá ka other part bó ṣe yẹ kó rí gangan bí United Nations ṣe bọ́n ṣe mean ẹ̀ gangan. God bless you. Ìpolówó ọjà làgùnmọ̀wẹ́ ìṣẹ́jú kan ìṣẹ́jú méjì ní kẹ́ fún mi ẹjọ́.
Mo kí gbogbo etí tó ń gbọ́ wa nílé mo sì kí gbogbo ojú tó ń wò wá nílé pé ojú tẹ fi ń wò wá ò ní fọ́ etí tẹ sì fi ń gbọ́ wa ò ní di. Orúkọ tèmi ni Godwin tí gbogbo ẹ̀yin èèyàn mọ̀ sí ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹ ṣe mọ̀ ní ìṣe wa wípé ìlera yín òun ló jẹ wá lógún a tún ti dé bí a ṣe ń dé o gbogbo ẹ̀yin tí ẹ ní ìṣòro tó jẹ́ pé ọkùnrin tó dàbí obìnrin nínú ilé ọkùnrin tí ò lè ṣojúṣe ẹ̀ pẹ̀lú ìyàwó ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin ẹ̀yin tó jẹ́ pé pépà lẹ má kà lálálẹ́ ẹ má ka pépà bò ẹ kàn sí wa a ní pákéjì oríṣiríṣi fún yín a ní 3-in-1 a ní 2-in-1 fẹ́yìn ọkùnrin tó lè jẹ́ kẹ́ tó máa jẹ́ kẹ́ ṣe bó ṣe yẹ kẹ́ ṣe bákan náà ni ìṣòro tí a ń pè ní arthritis yìí ó ń ṣọkùnrin ó ń ṣobìnrin orúnkún ríro ìbàdí ríro ọrùn ẹsẹ̀ ríro ẹlòmíì ó lè jẹ́ osteoarthritis lónìí ẹlòmíì rheumatoid arthritis ẹlòmíì ìdẹ̀rẹ̀ kò ní lè bẹ̀rẹ̀ mú nǹkan lẹ̀ ẹlòmíì ò lè bẹ̀rẹ̀ kírun ó ṣeé ṣe kó jẹ́ sciatica ni ó ṣeé ṣe kó jẹ́ lumbar spondylosis ni ẹlòmíì ìdẹ̀rẹ̀ arthritis ni tó bá ti di pé ìbàdí ń ro ẹ̀ ò lè bẹ̀rẹ̀ ẹlòmíì orúnkún ríro ẹlòmíì ẹsẹ̀ á máa gbóná ẹlòmíì àpapọ̀ rẹ̀ á máa gbóná ẹlòmíì ẹsẹ̀ á máa gbọ̀n ẹlòmíì ara á máa tá orí á máa tá àpapọ̀ ara á máa tá ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin Ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú ẹlòmíì ò lè fojú ọwọ́ ẹ̀ báyìí gbogbo ọwọ́ á máa ró gbogbo ẹ̀yin tẹ́ tí ń lò náà ẹ máa jẹ́rìí sí ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin Ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú bákan náà ni àwọn èèyàn tó ń tọ̀ ìtọ̀ àtọ̀jù yìí ó ṣeé ṣe kó jẹ́ pé prostate enlargement ni fún ẹ̀yin ọkùnrin tẹ́ ti lé lọ́mọ 40 ọdún tẹ́ bá ní prostate enlargement ẹ lè máa tọ̀ léraléra ẹlòmíì ò lè rí tọ̀tọ̀ rárá ẹlòmíì ìdẹ̀rẹ̀ tó bá fẹ́ tọ̀ á máa ní ìrora ẹlòmíì ìdẹ̀rẹ̀ kó tó débi tó máa tọ̀ sí ìtọ̀ ìtì máa jábọ́ ṣùgbọ́n obìnrin ní a máa tọ̀ léraléra kó tó débi tó máa tọ̀ sí ìtọ̀ ìyá ti máa jábọ́ ó ṣe é ṣe kó jẹ́ weakness of bladder làwọn ní àbí kó jẹ́ infection àbí kó jẹ́ diabetes insipidus tí a mọ̀ sí àtọ̀gbẹ ìyẹn náà lè fà á ká máa tọ̀ púpọ̀ jù ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin Ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú èyíkéyìí tó lè fà á kẹ́ ẹ máa tọ̀ púpọ̀ jù ara iṣẹ́ wa ni lára iṣẹ́ tèmi jogún látọ̀dọ̀ bàbá mi àtọ̀jú yín gbogbo ẹ̀ ó sì padà sí àyè ẹ̀ bó ṣe tó àti bó ṣe yẹ bákan náà ni àwọn tó ní hepatitis ooru inú ẹ̀dọ̀ ni ṣùgbọ́n tí hepatitis bá ti pẹ́ lára ó lè ba ẹ̀dọ̀ jẹ́ ó lè fà á kéèyàn ní enlarged liver ó dẹ̀ lè fa oríṣiríṣi ìṣòro sí ẹ̀dọ̀ yẹn ẹlòmíì á máa ní àmì bí kínú máa dùn bí kójú máa pọ́n kítọ̀ ẹ̀ máa pọ́n ẹlòmíì dẹ̀ kò ní rámì rárá bóyá lọ ṣàyẹ̀wò wá kàn sọ fún pé ó wà positive ẹ kàn sí wa ẹlòmíì ìdẹ̀rẹ̀ ó lè jẹ́ liver cirrhosis lòun ní èyíkéyìí tí ẹ ó ìbàjẹ́ ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin Ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú bí mo ṣe sọ̀rọ̀ ẹ̀yin tẹ́ ní prostate ó jẹ́ prostate enlargement ni ó jẹ́ prostate cancer ni ẹ kàn sí wa pẹ̀lú ògbọ́n Ọlọ́run ẹ ní rí bákan náà mọ́ mo ti sọ fún yín gbogbo ìṣòro yòówù kẹ́ ní ewé àti gbòǹkan mélé tí àwọn bàbá wa ń lò láyé àtijọ́ tá a ti gbé kalẹ̀ lọ́nà ìgbàlódé tó sì ṣe bẹbẹ lágbára òun là ń lò fún ọmọdé àti àgbà ẹ kàn sí wa ẹ ní kábàámọ̀ pẹ̀ ṣe bẹ́ẹ̀ ẹ̀rọ ìbánisọ̀rọ̀ mi ní 080-330-34777 080-330-34777 ẹ bá wà lamẹ́ríkà kẹ́ ẹ wà ní Spain kẹ́ ẹ wà ní UK ibikíbi tẹ́ ẹ bá wà ó jẹ́ Canada ni ó lè jẹ́ Port Harcourt ni ó jẹ́ Abuja ni ibikíbi tẹ́ ẹ bá wà ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin Ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú ẹ bá mi sọ̀rọ̀ lórí WhatsApp ẹ lè pè mí ẹ lè fi voice note lẹ̀ ẹ lè fi message lẹ̀ lórí WhatsApp máa dá yín lóhùn bó ṣe tó àti bó ṣe yẹ gbogbo ibi tẹ́ ẹ bá wà lè gbòógì wá máa dé ẹ sì ní kábàámọ̀ pé ẹ kàn sí iléeṣẹ́ Godwin Ìyá Ìjẹ̀bú ẹlòmíì apákan ara ẹ̀ á máa kú kí ló fà tápákan ara fi ń kú ẹ ẹ kọ̀ sí wa ẹ máa mọ̀ ẹlòmíì ọrùn àdédé máa sleep ẹlòmíì àyà ló máa dùn ẹlòmíì ẹ̀gbẹ́ ló máa dùn ẹlòmíì á máa wúkọ́ ó lè wúkọ́ kókó ti wà lẹ́nu ẹ̀ tipẹ́tipẹ́ tí ò sì ní lọ ẹlòmíì ìjẹ̀lẹ̀ ó máa ní ìṣòro àti breathe in oxygen breathe out carbon dioxide á máa ní ìṣòro á máa ní kàtà gbogbo ìgbà kí ló ń fà ó ṣeéṣe kó jẹ́ asthma ni ó ṣeéṣe kó jẹ́ bronchitis ó dẹ̀ ṣeéṣe kó jẹ́ pneumonia cough ìwọ ní tó bá ti kàn sí wa èyí tó bá jẹ́ nú ẹ̀ ló máa dìtámì irú egbògi tá a lè kẹ̀rà láti lè ṣe wa ẹ ṣe mọ̀ mo ti sọ fún yín o ẹ̀rọ ìbánisọ̀rọ̀ wa 08034747777 iléeṣẹ́ Godwell last bus stop yín ni pẹ̀lú agbára Ọlọ́run remember if it is not Godwell it can never be like Godwell. I used to tell you health is something to be treasured. Ire o.
MDT Clearing Freight and Logistics. Iṣẹ́ wọn dára, wọ́n ta sọ́sọ́ wọn kárí ayé.
MDT Clearing Freight and Logistics. Bá a ṣe kárí ayé bẹ́ẹ̀ ni òye iṣẹ́ yé wa. Cargo services wá dúró tán láti Nàìjíríà. A ó bá yín gbé nǹkan ránṣẹ́ sí àwọn èèyàn yín ní Europe, UK, US, Canada, Asia lọ bẹ́ẹ̀. Gààrí, epo pupa, ẹ̀gúsí, ẹja gbígbẹ, ìgbín, irú, àpọ̀n, aṣọ, ìlẹ̀kẹ̀, àwọn ìwé tó ṣe pàtàkì àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Kò tán síbẹ̀. MDT Clearing Services lékètéńté. Àṣẹ tó ń tẹjọba tá a gbà. Ó mú àwọn èèyàn yàn wá láàyò láti port. Ọwọ́ kan ni MDT á clear kọ̀ńténà yín jáde fún yín. Bó ṣe kọ̀ńténà tó kún fún káà lóríṣiríṣi tàbí ohun mìíràn. Àwọn òṣìṣẹ́ wa kọ̀ lálá. Professionalism wa kò lẹ́gbẹ́. MDT doorstep delivery service náà ò gbẹ́yìn. Níbikíbi lágbàáyé àwa gbé ọjà yín fún yín lẹ́nu ọ̀nà yín. MDT tún bá ní rajà. Product sourcing ìyẹn ni pé à á ràn yín lọ́wọ́ láti ra ohun tí ẹ fẹ́. À á sì fi ránṣẹ́ sí yín ní kámọ́ kóbó. Ní MDT Clearing Freight and Logistics. Akájú ẹ̀ àtò àlétò iṣẹ́ wa yàn ó yanjú lówó péréte. Ẹ máa bọ̀ lólulẹ̀ iṣẹ́ MDT ní nọ́mbà 22 Latif Salami Street Ajao Estate Ikeja Lagos. A sì tún ní ẹ̀ka káàkiri orílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà. Ẹ bá wa sọ̀rọ̀ 0818-231-1480 àti 0912-907-4004. Bákan náà ilé iṣẹ́ MDT lókè òkun wà ní Toronto, Canada. Please call +1647-289-5364. Website www.mdtfreights.com. MDT Clearing Freight and Logistics. Assure delivery.
Welcome back. Ẹ̀yin tí a wà lórí TikTok mo kí n pẹ́ kó àdúró tí òun bọ̀tẹ́ láìkí program yìí náà 1.4 like látàárọ̀ no gift whatsoever. Well ẹ tí ì lè mọ implication nǹkan tí mò ń ṣe nísìnyí àwọn tí ń bọ̀ lọ́jọ́ iwájú ló máa appreciate ẹ̀. God bless you. Ẹ ṣe fàdúró ti yín o lórí TikTok lórí Facebook lórí YouTube. God bless you. Now let's go straight to the second part. Ẹ já pa fóònù ilé iná kọ́mọ́ disturb wa. Now a ti ka declaration wọn. Wọ́n dẹ̀ fún ní wrong interpretation láti colonize mind àwọn èèyàn kan, láti arrest mind àwọn èèyàn kan, and unfortunately àwọn èèyàn náà ń tẹ̀lé wọn blindly, no second thought. Because mi ìmọ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ yẹn ṣe máa ka átíkù lásán tí ó wá bẹ̀ sí ilé ayé lé lórí tí ó mọ heart lórí ẹ̀. Ó dàbí ẹni pé kéèyàn ó rí design ilé tó fine lórí social media, wọ́n design lásán lórí o kọ́ ọmọ wá dream bí ẹni pọ̀ wà nínú ilé yẹn, bí kọ́ ọmọ gbénu ilé yẹn àkọ́jẹ́ wọ́n lọ wà nínú sitting room nísìnyí kọ́ wá jókòó báyìí gẹ́gẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ ni wọ́n ṣe ń dream of a nation tí ó exist. Ignorant wọ́n wá pọ̀ débi pé pẹ̀lú nǹkan tí ń ṣẹlẹ̀ lọ́wọ́ wọ́n sì gbà wípé àwọn ṣe the right thing. They are not ready to back off. wọ́n tún gbéra wọn mọ́ra káwọn ọmọ Yorùbá jáde lọ́pọ̀ yanturu àwọn dìndìnrín náà. Now, although adopting the guiding principles was an important step in changing the way people thought about extreme poverty, bracket as a violation of human rights, it was also a first step towards improving the legal situation of people experiencing poverty. Tabanika sọ̀rọ̀ lórí poverty nílẹ̀ Nàìjíríà nísìnyí. Poverty wà throughout the land, no doubt about that. But àwọn ará òkè ọya ló wà nínú extreme poverty. To answer the question of why this is the first step, we need to talk about what the guiding principles have from a legal perspective. Basically speaking, legal act can be divided into two different types. The first is legally binding. This is known as hard law. The second is non-binding. This is known as soft law. The difference between the two is that the first must be respected by public authorities, hence the word hard law. While they may or may not have to comply with the second one, the guiding principle fall into latter category. While the guiding principles are based on several legally binding international human rights conventions, they do not in themselves create a new right in the form of freedom from poverty or freedom from socio-economic discrimination. Help me call òmìnira people to come and learn. Ẹja nurture wọn, ẹja tọ́, ẹja kọ́ wọn, ẹja let's teach them. Ọgbọ́n mi dáadáa o. Why the guiding principles are based on several legally binding international human rights conventions, they do not in themselves create a new right in the form of freedom from poverty or freedom from socio-economic discrimination. Why táwọn eléyìí wá create new right in form of freedom from poverty or freedom from socio-economic discrimination? Wọ́n yàn wá jẹ, wọ́n rẹ́ wá jẹ, wọ́n lò wá lú ẹ̀bùn, wọ́n lò wá lú ẹrú, wọ́n fipá bá àwọn ìyàwó wa lò pọ̀, wọn ò já dágo, wọn ò já sọ̀gbìn, wọn ò já sígbà, wọn ò já sàwo. That is not enough for you to create a state within a state. The guiding principles are a kind of guide on how to interpret existing agreements from the perspective of the rights of the people affected by poverty. Agreement. Firstly, pẹ̀lú àwọn representative wa láti state wa láti federal constituency wa láti senatorial district wa. But unfortunately, táwọn tí mo kà á lẹ̀ yẹn bá dé lónìí, problem là ń lọ gbé bá wọn, individual problems. Ọmọ mi fẹ́ sanwó school, ọmọ mi wálé, àfẹ́ ṣèkó mọ́, mo fẹ́ kẹ́ bá mi employ ọmọ mi wáṣẹ́, ọmọ mi wá connection. Ọmọ mi fẹ́ wọ ọlọ́pàá, ele fẹ́ wọ sọ́jà, ele fẹ́ jọ immigration. Tẹ́ bá ti bá ń fún slot ntí kálukú yín bá káàkiri nìyẹn. Discuss the collective problems. In the case of the creation of new human rights standard, we can very often observe that in the first instance, the acts adopted have a legally non-binding form only to take the form of binding legal acts in the end. So, now, Jemberembi, what is free, prior, and informed consent? References to free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, are found throughout the declaration. Declaration tí wọ́n interpretation líle. They emphasize the importance of recognition and upholding the rights of indigenous peoples and ensuring that there is effective and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in decisions that affect them, their communities and territories. More specifically, FPIC describes processes that are free from manipulation or coercion, informed by the adequate and timely information, and occur sufficiently prior to a decision to that indigenous rights and interests can be incorporated or addressed effectively as part of the decision-making process. All as part of meaningfully aiming to secure the consent of affected indigenous people. Secure the consent of affected indigenous people. FPIC is about working together in partnership and respect. In partnership and respect. Not in disintegration or violence. In partnership and respect. In many ways, it reflects the ideas behind the relationship with indigenous peoples by striving to achieve consensus as parties work together in good faith or on decisions that impact indigenous rights and interests. Despite what some have suggested, it is not about having a veto over government decision making. Despite what some have suggested, despite intonitiri Marcus àtàwọn sọ̀ngbẹ wọ́n lè suggest pé bó ṣe ríre, it is not about having a veto over government decision making. Ìyẹn ò túmọ̀ sí pé kẹwàá against ìjọba tí ń bẹ lóde, gbéná wojú ìjọba tí ń bẹ lóde, try láti dojú ìjọba tí ń bẹ lóde bolẹ̀, tàbí láti wá sọ fún wa pé create government tí nínú government nínú ìlú kan nínú country kan. Ta ló interpret United Nations Declaration fún yín? Who? Àbọ̀yè òye ni abẹ́kàwé ẹ̀kọ́ pọlọ ni abẹ́kàwé ẹ̀kọ́ gbọ́n ni abẹ́kàwé kò yé ni ẹ̀kan ń sọ òyìnbó ni ọ̀pọ̀ ẹlòmíì gbóyìnbó o. Tó bá sọ pé kí wọ́n interpret nǹkan wò lè interpret ẹ o. Tó bá sọ pé kí wọ́n translate nǹkan yóò dẹ̀ tìkẹ́ mọ́ wọn lọ́wọ́ o. It is important to understand FPIC in context. Different initiatives will have different impacts on indigenous peoples rights. FPIC may require different processes or new creative ways of working together to ensure meaningful and effective participation in decision making. There are many examples where collaboration, co-management, or co-ownership are already taking place across the country. These types of approaches increase the credibility of the institutions and help to ensure the legitimacy of the decision they make, which in turn helps to reduce litigation. Implementing the declaration means building on these examples, looking for other ways in which we can work collaboratively on key issues. Níbi tá ẹ rò pé wọ́n ti ń yan ẹjẹ́ yẹn, ẹ try láti collabo pẹ̀lú government, ẹ work it out. Ẹ discuss main issue. Ẹ má discuss irrelevant things. Ensuring that decision making processes include in the space, including the time and information required for indigenous people who stand to be affected to participate in and influence the process. Learn more about some of these many examples of the declaration in action here. Nebo, what does this mean for the existing duty to consult? 1. The government of a country has a constitutional duty. Gbọ́ mi dáadáa o. The government of a country has a constitutional duty to consult indigenous people when it considers measures that might adversely impact their potential or establish aboriginal or treaty rights. This has been consistently confirmed by the courts. The government of a country must consistently work to uphold this duty and must show its commitment to taking additional steps to do so. Ẹ bá gbé problem lọ sọ́dọ̀ ìjọba gẹ́gẹ́ bí region gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹ̀yà wọ́n gbọ́dọ̀ pay attention wọ́n dẹ̀ gbọ́dọ̀ reason pẹ̀lú yín. As the principles respecting the government of the country's relationship with indigenous peoples note. respecting the government of the country's relationship with indigenous peoples note free, prior and informed consent building on and goes beyond the legal duty to consult. Consultation obligations can also be set out in legislation or modern treaties. Implementation of the declaration through this act will inform how the government approaches meetings. These legal duties going forward, it will do so in a way that provides greater clarity and creates greater certainty over time for indigenous groups and all ethnic nationalities. Wọ́n ò sọ pé kẹ́ ẹ jáde kúrò nínú country tẹ́ wà. The act itself does not immediately change countries' existing duty to consult indigenous groups. Other consultation and participation requirements set out in legislation like the Impact Assessment Act. What does this mean for natural resource development? The implementation of the declaration has the potential to make meaningful change to how indigenous peoples, communities and business participate in sustainable natural resources development. This includes having indigenous peoples as full partners in the natural resources and net zero carbon economic, and ensuring that indigenous peoples have a seat at the table for decisions that may affect their communities. Ṣé ẹ ní seat nínú decision making ni? Together we can develop a stronger, more sustainable and predictable path for indigenous peoples, the government of a country and industry. The declaration can be used as a guidepost. Nti declaration wà fún nìyẹn, guidepost. Kì í ṣe step make, kì í ṣe force action making. As a guidepost in establishing those relationships. Because when indigenous people are provided the opportunity to participate as full partners in economic development, it is a reflection of their inherent rights to self-determination. What does this mean for fisheries in Nigeria? Tó bá jẹ́ Nigeria ni iṣẹ́ apẹja ò fi bẹ́ẹ̀ pọ̀, ṣùgbọ́n fáwọn tó wà lẹ́gbẹ̀ẹ́ òkun, fáwọn tó wà lọ́sà, fáwọn tó ń ṣiṣẹ́ wọn ń bẹ̀, fáwọn tó wà lórí òkun, àwọn tó wà lápapá wọ̀fà àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Fisheries, oceans, aquatic habitat and marine waterways are economically and culturally significant for indigenous peoples. Ọgbọ́n mi dáadáa, the sustainable use of the fisheries resource, the protection of fish and fish habitats, the conservation and management of oceans, and through the country coast guard, the safety of those on the water and the protection of the marine environment are shared priorities held in common with indigenous peoples in a nation and the government of nation. Now, to the best of my knowledge, torílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà bá lè padà sí regional government, ilẹ̀ Yorùbá máa ní àwọn nǹkan kan láti ní owó lọ́wọ́, because kálẹ̀ mi jẹ́ kan nínú àwọn tí ń ṣèjọba ni. Orílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà ní opportunity tó pọ̀. One, a ní òkun, a ní ọ̀sà. To the best of my knowledge, ẹ̀tọ́ wa ò import ẹja wá látòkè òkun bí ti wù kọ́ mọ́. Òótọ́ ọ̀rọ̀ lẹ gbọ́ lẹ́nu mi o. Òkun àtọ̀sà as a government wọ́n lè fi sin ẹja tá a máa jẹ tá a ní jẹran tá a ní jẹ màlúù lójoojúmọ́. Yes, ṣebí individual ń sin ẹja tí wọ́n dẹ̀ ń ta ẹja lọ́pọ̀ as a government of a nation. Lagos State lásán wọ́n lè sin ẹja tí gbogbo Èkó ọmọ jẹ nínú ọ̀sà. Kí làwọn ẹja kéékèèké fingernails àbí ẹ kó bí 1 billion dà sómi. kẹwàá fi wọ́n lẹ̀ fóṣù méjì oṣù mẹ́ta. ẹ̀tọ́ wa ò import to frozen food from any country. ẹja tá à ń jẹ káàkiri orílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà lónìí imported fish ni. òkú Èkó kí ló dé tí òjò kú Ìbàdàn, òkú Èkó kí ló dé tàn mọ́ pálẹ̀kó kó jókòó Èkó ń bẹ̀. ẹ jẹ́ sáré tẹ̀síwájú kí n sáré parí ẹ̀jà rẹ̀. The government of a country works with indigenous people through well-established processes to seek input in decision-making and management activities. For example, advisory councils, collaborative management arrangements, and bilateral discussions. Through these relationships, the government of a nation collaborates with indigenous people in a manner that gives voice to the declaration. While the act itself does not immediately change any operations, the act itself does not immediately change any operations. Why tí àwọn Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí lò as instrumental láti change operation orílẹ̀-èdè Nàìjíríà? Why the act itself does not immediately change any operations, policies or laws related to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or the country's Coast Guard implementing the declaration means building of our current processes, partnerships and collaborative arrangements with indigenous people to look for other ways in which we can work together on key fisheries and aquatic resources issues in a manner that gives a voice to the declaration. a ń sọ̀rọ̀ nípa àwọn onílẹ̀ tó jẹ́ pé àwọn ni wọ́n nílẹ̀ tí omi wà tá a ti ń pẹja. kálé tí ọ̀sà la ti ń pẹja tí gbogbo Nàìjíríà ń jẹ nísìnyí. ní tí wọ́n sọ ń bẹ̀ nìyẹn o. àwọn tán lomi tá à ń pẹja lọ́dọ̀ wọn kí láǹfààní tí wọ́n fi ju bóòlù àṣẹ nírọ̀ wọn sẹ́gbẹ̀ẹ́ bóòlù ṣe máa jẹ́ pàwọn gangan náà ni wọ́n ń pa àwọn ẹja yìí làkó síbẹ̀ tí wọ́n ń pa. Why the act itself okay arrangement with indigenous people to look for other ways in which we can work together on key fisheries and aquatic resource issues in a manner that gives a voice to the declaration. The development of the action plan will be a venue for advancing discussions with indigenous people on ways to achieve the objectives of the declaration while advancing efforts to ensure indigenous people participate as full partners in the sustainable use of the fishery resource, the protection of fish and fish habitat, and the conservation and management of our oceans. Àwọn indigenous people náà ni ẹ̀yàn kọ́ máa lásàlákòótó etídò kọ́ máa bójútó etídò. Question: Does the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act affect provinces and territories? The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act only imposes obligations on the federal government. It is intended to create a framework to support the government of a country to further implement the declaration, not to secede for that government. A framework to support the government of a country to further implement the declaration. This act affirms that the declaration is a universal international human rights instrument with application in country's law. This means that the declaration is an important source of interpret provisional and federal law. In fact, provincial and federal courts are already using the declaration in this regard. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on all levels of government to adopt the declaration as a framework for reconciliation. Many provincial and territorial governments in a country are also using the declaration as a framework for reconciliation and to actively engage with indigenous peoples on matters that affect them. This preamble to this act specifically recognizes that provincial and territorial governments have their own approaches and authorities relating to the implementation of the declaration. The obligation set out in the act applies specifically to the government of the country in consultation and cooperation with indigenous people. Consultation and cooperation. This includes the requirement to take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of a country that fall within federal authority are aligned with the declaration, the development of an action plan, and the tabling and annual reports in Parliament. Together, these provide a framework for the federal government's implementation of the declaration. Nothing in the federal legislation prevents provinces or territories from developing their own plan and approaches for implementation of the declaration or require them to do so. What does implementation the declaration mean for a country? Bó la ṣe fẹ́ implement the declaration ti United Nations fún orílẹ̀-èdè. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act will provide a shared roadmap for indigenous peoples, industries, communities, and government to work together. It will help strengthen relations between the government of a country and indigenous people. It will also ensure indigenous rights are carefully considered in reviewing and updating federal laws that affect those rights. Among the main goals of the declaration is to support indigenous people's exercise of the right to self-determination. Recent events have also underscored the persistence and armed systemic racism and discrimination that indigenous people face on a daily basis. This act requires the government of the country, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, to prepare an action plan that includes measures to address injustices, combat prejudice, and eliminate all forms of violence and discrimination against indigenous people. Over time, implementing the declaration will deepen understanding and respect while creating stronger and healthier indigenous communities and contributing to their and country's economic growth. That means jobs and opportunity that benefit all while protecting the land, air, and water. It means building a brighter future and a better way to country for all. So that is all, my dearest people. So àwọn ọ̀wá mọ ibi tí àwọn Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí, Marcus Ìjìnlẹ̀ àtàwọn ìsọ̀ǹgbẹ wọn tí wọ́n ti ní rí nínú declaration tán mú jáde wọn wípé káwọn ó fáwọn láàyè láti create adelé ìjọba. Ó dẹ̀ darí ẹ̀ tí àwọn lọ sí state government house láti lọ overtake ibẹ̀, láti lọ claim ibẹ̀. Well, eléyìí ṣe fóònù bí kì í ṣe fún ọ̀la àti ọjọ́ iwájú, torí like I said, àwọn èèyàn kan lè dé kí wọ́n máa wá sọ wípé àwọn Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí dẹ̀ try ń gbà yẹn o, àwọn èèyàn kan ló dí wọn lọ́wọ́ tí wọ́n support tí wọ́n ń gbà yẹn. A ò lè pẹ̀lú ọ̀bọ jáwùrà, gbogbo wa ò dẹ̀ lè sùn ká kọrí síbì kan náà. We all want self-determination. We want a working community. We want a working government, not a crawling one. But still, it takes time. It takes wisdom. It takes commitment. It takes many things. So, bàbá fẹ́ kúrò ní Nàìjíríà, àjọsọ gbogbo wa ní o, gbogbo adẹ̀lá ní role láti play ń bẹ̀. Ìṣe èèyàn méjì mẹ́ta ni ó dúró sí kọ̀rọ̀ kan tí wọ́n sọ pé wọ́n fẹ́ gba nation fún wa. It can never work. It will never work. It will never even exist. Àwọn kan lọ ta, àwọn kan lọ dalẹ̀, kò lè wọ́ọ̀kì. Gbígba orílẹ̀-èdè dàbí sísòṣèlú ni. ẹ bá fẹ́ jẹ president yóò approach yóò pẹ̀tù sí yóò advice yóò ṣe bí ọ̀dẹ̀. kì í ṣe kí wọ́n sọ pé ẹnìkan bínú kọ́ ẹnìkan máa bínú lọ ẹni tí ń bínú lọ láwọn èèyàn tiẹ̀. wọ́n ìṣe bẹ́ẹ̀ ni ó ṣèlú o wọ́n máa ń fa everybody mọ́ra ní àtọmọ ẹgbẹ́ o àtẹgbẹ́ alátakò wọn máa ń fọdọ́gbọ́n fà mọ́ra. ẹgbẹ́ alátakò gan-an ní ìdíjú wọ́n á ti penetrate látọ̀dọ̀ ẹnìkan bá wa sọ fáwọn tó kù náà a ní meeting pẹ̀lú yín o wọ́n mọ̀ foríṣiríṣi nǹkan tí wọ́n lójú bàbá ilé wọlé ẹ̀bùn ayé ń tinú bọ́n ṣe sòṣèlú nìyẹn bí wọ́n bá fẹ́ borí léde bọ́n ṣe sọ nìyẹn ìṣèkẹ́yìn kan wá dúró pé kíní kẹ́ máa pa àwọn kan lọ́dàlẹ̀ kẹ́ máa pẹ́yìn nìkan lórí jìnnà ọmọ Yorùbá pé àwa tó kù ọmọ àlè Yorùbá làwa ọmọdé tó ní bóun bá dàgbà òun máa dorí adìẹ orí adìẹ ò ní jẹ́ ó dàgbà o orí ẹyẹlé lòun máa jẹ jàre orí ẹyẹlé ò ní jẹ́ ó dàgbà. You can never do it alone and we are not in that space for now. orí level tá a wà ní pé kágbárùkù tìjọba tí ń bẹ lóde ìjọba Aṣíwájú Bọ́lá Ahmed Tinubu that we have belief in him that he will do well, he will make things happen, Nigeria will be better under him. Let's support him, put everything behind him to do it. àmọ́ gbàgbé o dìbò fún Bọ́lá Tinubu lélẹ́yìí o tó o bá ti dìbò fún lẹ́ẹ̀kejì má bínú pé mò ń kàǹpé o reality mo sọ fún ọ. tó bá yẹ bọ́ sáwọn ará bí lọ́wọ́ sọ ọmọ géèmù oríṣiríṣi don play a máa wá tún fún ọ tó bá yá akandé jẹ́ mọ́ lọ. ẹ jẹ́ kí n yọ̀ǹda ẹ̀yin olóríire èèyàn tẹ́ ẹ ti ń bá mi bọ̀ tẹ́ ẹ wà pẹ̀lú mi àtẹ̀yìn tẹ́ ẹ padà wò ó ẹ má gbàgbé ẹ bá mi subscribe sí Yorùbá Parapọ̀ TV Yorùbá Parapọ̀ TV àánú Olódùmarè ò ní fi sílẹ̀ support tẹ́lẹ̀ fún mi ní ìsìn nìyẹn ẹ bá ń subscribe sí mò ń bẹ̀ yín ni o mi ì sákọ́ o ẹ bá ń subscribe sí tẹ́ bá wo gbogbo ohun tẹ́mi àkàrà ń ṣe láti lẹ̀ ẹ máa rí pé kò sẹ́lẹ̀ ìtọ́jẹ́ pé kò nítumọ̀ mo lè má ṣe nítorí òní mo lè ṣe nítorí ọ̀la bọ̀ tó wúlò fún wa lónìí náà yóò wá wúlò fáwọn tí ń bọ̀ lẹ́yìn wa ọ̀la at least yóò wà on record pé àwọn Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí ẹlẹ́tàn ni wọ́n o Marcus Ìjìnlẹ̀ kò lóye kankan kò mọ̀ nǹkan kan Dúpẹ́ Onítìrí ọmọ nǹkan kan ló jẹ́ kán máa sọ̀rọ̀ bí ọmọdé lọ́rọ̀ wọn fi ń rún nínú lẹ́ẹ̀fi pé sẹ́yìn náà ní sọ̀rọ̀ yìí sáwọn eléyìí ronú kan tó sọ̀rọ̀ sáwọn eléyìí sàn ní làákàyè báyìí. àná Olódùmarè ò ní fi sílẹ̀ o and again n ò lè déédéé lọ bẹ́ẹ̀ láì sọ FM radio project mi níbi tí mo ti ní ìdí èèyàn 500 tó lè fún mi ní 100,000 naira tàbí jù bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ olówó ni mo ní radio station mo ń tẹnu mọ́ because ìgbà tẹ́ máa ná 100 million 200 million láti ní radio station ṣe rí pé kọjá yìí ní fẹ́mi tí mo jẹ́ tálíkà àtọmọ tálíkà ẹ̀ tí ò ní nǹkan kan tí mo wá dàyà kọ́ ṣùgbọ́n nígbà tí mo ní Ọlọ́run with God all things are possible. I have belief in God. I trust him and I trust myself and I believe in you. I mean you. Gbogbo èèyàn kọ́ ló lè kọ̀ pàkọ́ àwọn èèyàn kan sì máa lómi àánú lójú ẹjẹ́ àtàrà ọmọ ìsìn lọ́hùn ẹjẹ́ àtàrà ẹ̀yìn lọ́hùn ẹjẹ́ àtàrà ẹ̀dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ Ọlọ́run èlò 100,000 kò jówó fàájì ẹlòmíì lọ ẹlòmíì lè fún mi jù bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ ẹlòmíì gan fún mi jù bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ so má yín mo sí mi má fi mi ṣe ẹ̀yẹ́ ìmúyíyán àti yẹ̀yẹ́ ìmọ̀ motivate mi síwájú sí ni mo ti prepare wáyé eléyìí tí mo wáyé ẹnìkan ò dẹ̀ ní control life mi lọ́wọ́ ẹnìkan ò ní remote control life mi lọ́wọ́ if you think without you I will not exist or will not progress or will not do things òun parọ́ tán rẹ ni o you are not God ká ẹni tiẹ̀ ńlẹ̀ kọ́ lọ́wọ́ tẹ́rọ̀gì tiẹ̀ láìsí mi ọ̀rẹ́ mi ò jẹ láìsí mi ọ̀rẹ́ mi ò mu wọ́n bẹ láyé ni òwèrè ní máa ń sọ ọ́ bọ́ọ̀ bá sí láyé ọ̀rẹ́ rẹ yóò fi sàláàdì mu gàrí lọ́la come on tọ́lọ́ bá rẹ̀ ń sí mi tẹ́ fẹ́ assist mi ẹ pè mí lórí ẹ já sọ̀rọ̀ lórí WhatsApp kí n fún yín ní account number mi WhatsApp number mi lélẹ̀ +234 904 851 9362 +234 904 851 9362 àná Olódùmarè ò ní fi ń sílẹ̀ o ẹ má gbàgbé o ẹ subscribe sí Yorùbá Parapọ̀ TV ẹ bá ń subscribe sí Awikonko TV àti Awikonko TV live náà ṣùgbọ́n mo níṣòro díẹ̀ pẹ̀lú àwọn méjèèjì ń lọ́wọ́ báyìí Yorùbá Parapọ̀ TV ni ẹ ti máa darapọ̀ mọ́ mi God bless you ìdáwọ́lé yín ọmọ yọrí sí rere o wàhálà àti ìdààmú ò ní mọ́lé yín o ọ̀ràn tẹ́ ẹ̀ mọ́wọ́ tẹ́ ẹ̀ mẹ́sẹ̀ ò ní di tiyín lágbára Ọlọ́run ẹ̀ làlùyọ ẹ̀ ní làlùwọlẹ̀ ẹ̀ ṣàṣeyọrí ẹ̀ ní ṣàṣetì ẹ̀ ṣàṣeyege ẹ̀ ní kú sọ́nà bí èéfín lágbára Ọlọ́run má gbìyànjú láti fa àyàn wálẹ̀ lónìí bọ́ọ̀ bá lè gbéyàn dìde fi kálukú lẹ̀ jẹ́ kálukú ọmọ rìnrìn àjò ayé ẹ̀ Ọlọ́run ní lọ́dà gbogbo wa Ọlọ́run lọ́dẹ̀ mọ̀ ibi tí ẹ̀dá kan ń lọ àti ibi tí ẹ̀dá kan máa dé má jẹ́ olùdènà tàbí alátakò fọmọlàkejì ẹ̀ God bless you all. ẹ like ẹ follow page mi lórí Facebook Awikonko TV àti Awikonko TV live ẹ subscribe sí YouTube channel mi Yorùbá Parapọ̀ TV Awikonko TV àti Awikonko TV live. èdè àti àṣà Yorùbá ò ní wọ́ mi orílẹ̀-èdè Yorùbá ò ní dàrú ìlú ẹnì kọ̀ọ̀kan wa yóò tòrò mìnìmìnì bí omi àfòwúrọ̀ pọ́n mo mọ̀ pé mo ti gba táìmù yín jù wow 1 hour 56 minutes a sọ̀rọ̀ fún 2 hours oore ọ̀fẹ́ Ọlọ́run náà ni àti kọ́kọ́ sí 1 hour tẹ́lẹ̀tẹ́lẹ̀ oore ọ̀fẹ́ Ọlọ́run náà ni àná Olódùmarè ò ní fi ń sílẹ̀ oorun ayọ̀ lásùn bàtà àbájí láàárọ̀ ọ̀la wọnú kọ́mọ̀jẹ̀pá àti wọ́jọ́ kejì ọ̀rẹ́dì òun àti wọ́jọ́ kejì ọ̀rẹ́dì bàtà àbájí láàárọ̀ yìí lágbára Ọlọ́run inú ayọ̀ àti ìgbéga la máa jí sí lágbára Ọlọ́run ẹ̀ ní dàwátì n ò ní dàwátì àti mí àtẹ̀yìn kájọ fa ìkú dẹ́gbẹ̀ra oorun ayọ̀ ó dàárọ̀ o God bless you on TikTok mi ní wáyé tí o lágbára Ọlọ́run ẹ̀ ní dẹni àná ẹ̀ ní dàgbégbìn God bless you all lórí Facebook àti YouTube ikú ò ní páyín ẹ̀ ní gbégbìn ẹ̀ ní gbèsìn láṣẹ Èdùmàrè ẹ ṣe ẹ̀kọ́ àdúró tí o God bless you mọ̀ pé púpọ̀ lára yín ẹ bá ń subscribe sí channel yẹn mo trust yín bẹ́ẹ̀ ṣe ń tẹ̀ àkàdùn ní mú yín lọ́wọ́ bí ẹ bá ti tẹ subscribe ẹ gbọ́wọ́lé notification bell yẹn kẹ́ẹ̀kan click lórí all ẹ máa rí notification ìgbàkúgbà tí n bá fi fídíò síbẹ̀ ó ṣeé ṣe kó jẹ́ Yorùbá Parapọ̀ nìkan ni màá máa lò láwọn àkókò kan God bless you all ó dàárọ̀ o.